Hey guys, it's that time again. We're going to do another book review, but this time, it's not going to be a negative one. This one is going to be very much positive. Good news. Something to look forward to. Something to actually cut through all this grime that we're going through, all this misery. Bit of a spoiler there. Yeah, basically there's options. There's ways through this, and this book is part of that. So, we're going to review a very special book for me. He's one of my favourite philosophers, Pierre Joseph Proudhon, the French anarchist, inventor of mutualism. Now, you might not have heard of mutualism very much, and that's because, unlike capitalism and communism and even fascism, mutualism doesn't need a state. And who needs it these days? I mean, let's look at all the shit that it's doing. The parasitic warmonger, who needs it? How about we have a socio-economic system that doesn't need it? And where we're going to find it? Well, we'll find it right here, in the philosophy of misery. So what this book is... Oh, do I get a thumbnail? There we go, there's a thumbnail. What this book is... Let's try and get this. It's a huge book. It takes a lot of chewing through. I've had to read it about 3 times. I was going to review it a month ago, but then I realised, well, let's just give you the story, because there's going to be a part 2 to this video. It's going to be Karl Marx. He wrote The Poverty of Philosophy. So there's a bit of a story behind this book. The Poverty of Misery, The Philosophy of Misery. The way it goes is, back in the 1850s, there was capitalism was very young at the time, and the government was fairly lax. So basically, factory owners, businesses, they were running slave rings, essentially. They had, kids in there with, the tiny little hands because it could fit into the machines and stuff. Even factory owners themselves started to have a moral meltdown. This is where the utopian socialists came from. Guys like Robert Owen, and even Engels, because he was a factory owner. A lot of people saw the problems of capitalism back then. Everyone was talking about it. One of the main guys, well, and you've all heard of Karl Marx, but Karl Marx actually wasn't that famous back then. More famous than him was our boy, Pierre Joseph Proudhon. So, the story goes, he wrote this book in criticism of political economy, and he came up with his own system. He called it the economic science back in the day, and he had the theory of proportional values, which eventually became his Bank of Exchange. Had a lot of great ideas back in the day. A lot of people did. The utopian socialists like Robert Owen did. And basically my theory is Marx just absorbed that like a sponge, because he pretends to be somebody for the people, Marx. And if he was, he would have been fine with Proudhon's book, The Philosophy of Misery. But he wasn't. He wrote a book-long response called The Poverty of Philosophy. Now, the reason why I called it this is because this book has 3 titles. It's The Philosophy of Misery, The Philosophy of Poverty, which is the one Marx was inspired by, and Social of Economic Contradictions. 3 titles. And here's a bit of controversy for you. It comes in 2 volumes. The second volume has gone, vanished, lost to history, and I've tried to find it. So when I'm looking for this second book, I've discovered something else. There's another book called The Solution to the Social Problem, which is also essentially lost to history. Now you've got to wonder, what was in it? What was the excuse they used as it was untranslated? So I've tried to buy, I wish I had it here. I tried to buy the French version of The Solution to the Social Problem, which I think might have been the second book. It's not, but it might have been. I thought it was. So anyway, I bought a French version, and it turns out that it's completely different. I don't know what's in there. It's talking about the revolution in society. It's not. We'll get to that. I'm rambling a bit. But there's a bit of a story behind this. To put it in a nutshell, Volume 2 of The Philosophy of Misery is gone. The excuse they give is it wasn't translated. Now, when you consider that Pierre Joseph Proudhon was as famous as Marx, as influential as Marx, he was right up there with, there's a lot of intellectuals back then, like Bakunin, and there's all sorts of intellectuals back then. The idea that Proudhon's works wouldn't have all been translated by now, almost 200 years later, is ridiculous. The excuse they give is that it hasn't been translated. But some of the excuses they give in the solution to the social problem is they just left out politics of the day. Now, what are those politics of the day? What were they talking about? What was so controversial that they had to not let we, the modern readers, learn about it? Well, I think it was a theory so devastating to how things are currently running, they just couldn't let us read it. And you can basically figure it out. I think I've figured it out by reading Proudhon's works. It's almost like Battleship. You can see where the gap is when you're putting the pegs in the thing. So, but before I say for sure what it is, I need to do more research. But in the meantime, I thought I'd let you know what this book contains. And the book after that will be my opponent's ideology review, which is Karl Marx. And this told me a lot about Marx. I was wondering whether Karl Marx was really a man of the people or not, because he criticized capitalism really well. Didn't get too in depth on communism, ironically enough, but he's the father of authoritarian socialism. Proudhon is libertarian socialism. Marx really wants the centralized state, the all-powerful parasite. Capitalism has something in common with that. It wants an all-powerful parasite, a war machine, which just continually goes and eats things. Proudhon, in his mutualism, is the only ism that doesn't actually feed that. Doesn't allow anything left for the parasite class, for the war machine. What Proudhon's system does is it gives the workers the full value of their labour. Labour exchanges products for products. You do not get a better working class system than mutualism. And maybe that's why you haven't heard of it. So, let's get into this book. It's going to be a choppy video. Yes, it's way too much to talk about. It's a chewy book. And if you're going to buy it yourself, I'll give you a heads up, because I figured this out halfway through. Basically, Proudhon talks in a way where he does something called the Hegelian dialect. And if you don't know what that is, it's when you take two opposing ideas, like capitalism and socialism, and you grind them together, and you get the synthesis. I might have to record this again with all the tongue ties. Antithesis and thesis. Grind them together, synthesis. That's what people are talking about when they talk about the Hegelian dialect. It was a way of thinking back then. Very, very popular. It was very in vogue. And Proudhon does this in this. So the problem is, when you're reading this, if you come away from the book for a while and then come back, you might mistake Proudhon as arguing for monopoly or arguing for taxation. He's not. He's pointing out the goods and the bads of each system. And then at the end of the chapter, he puts them together and you get a synthesis. Like I say, if you're a worker, if you're in the freedom movement, you should be a mutualist. Pay attention to this video. Look into this ideology yourself. Obviously, communism's got its problems. Obviously, capitalism's got its problems. And now we're living in an era called stakeholder capitalism, where those two are coming together. All powerful. One world government with a super powerful party telling all these workers and producers exactly what they need to do and how to do it. If we're not going to play the mutualism card now, we can never ever play it again. So, let's get into this book. So this book starts off, a bit lofty, with an analysis of God. Now, Proudhon's an atheist, and he encourages you guys to be atheists too. But he needs God he explains it on a whole load of lists. He needs God for a whole load of reasons, because you need to acknowledge God, essentially, if you're an atheist. The point that he makes is, to negate God, you have to first define God. So Proudhon starts his story, this book, by defining God, or what he thinks it is. And he essentially says, he brings up, like I said, there's a reason why he brings up God. In a book, and he says, it's weird to bring up God in a book of political economy, and it is, but it makes sense when you read it. So, he defines God as, he thinks it's like a collective intelligence of people. It's just how we've got our own intelligence, we've got our own moral law and all that kind of stuff. And our sense of God is our just awareness of what everybody else would think. He also defines God as the more metaphysical, impossible, cosmic order of things. And it's that part that comes up in his book quite a bit. Actually, the first part does as well, the collective intelligence of people. But basically, the way Proudhon sees God isn't the written in a holy book version of God, where you can see you doing stuff and get pissed off and, reward you and enjoys the smell of lambs and stuff like that, like Joe Biden and a kid's back. God doesn't do that stuff in Proudhon's mind. He's more like a metaphysical thing, an impossibility, like I say, an order, an impossible order is probably the best way to put it. So there's loads to it. Like I say, I keep saying it's a chewy book. It's like sticky toffee. You got to chew through it. Another reason he talks about God is because the language he's using, because of history, and because history acknowledged the existence of God or believed in God, our language it pulls that with it. So because Proudhon's coming up with a social system, he needs to speak of God. He needs to speak of he needs to acknowledge some kind of cosmic correctness with the word. Every constitution does, essentially. So he brings it up in that direction. He brings it up to basically show his goodwill to people who are about to criticize him. Because he's going to piss off a lot of people with this book. And also, he brings up the point that to criticize political economy, that may confuse people. When you hear political economy, think old-fashioned capitalism. He uses the word political economy as the main villain in this book. And to criticize it in his day would be like criticizing God in the old days, in the feudal times. Basically, by criticizing political economy, he knows he's going to have priests, apologists, zealots, he's going to be called a blasphemer and all this kind of stuff. But he has to. He's going to take it. He's going to have to go through all that. So he brings up God in those sense, and then he wraps the book up completely with a very interesting take on how man and God are in relation to each other. And then something I noticed when I was reading this is he brings up 3 authorities that mankind need to destroy: property, state, and God. He destroys state in this book. He destroys property in What is Property, his most famous work. But he hasn't done God yet. So I think you realize that at the last moment, like, sacre le bleu, I need to add God to my masterpiece. So I think he added God last minute, on the beginning and the end. But we'll save the last chapter for that. So, after he brought up God in an economy book, we're on to 14 minutes. I knew this would be a long video. Shit. All right. We'll get into the reason this book exists. Basically, back then, we're talking about 1850s here. Try and imagine, this is the time when Karl Marx was still alive, and they knew each other, Proudhon and Karl Marx. Everybody was talking about the evils of capitalism back then. And there was a place called the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences, and they posed a question to the world. Well, France, back then, would have been the town. So basically, they posed a question saying, what is the source of misery? What is the cause of misery? And a lot of people wrote in to answer that question. And on getting all these results, they decided, actually, you know what? We're not going to publish this. So they withdrew the question. And then after pressure, they finally said that the hopes of the Friends of the Association were groundless. So that was the reason they decided to not publish all of these guys' works. And then after that, they started asking questions that led society to lead the answers to a more materialistic and pursuing luxury lifestyle. They got rattled by the answers of what was causing all the misery. Now, Proudhon got really angry at this, and he said these guys aren't fit for purpose anymore. So he set out to write this book, The Philosophy of Misery. Strap in, folks. This is a bumpy ride, and I'm going to try and summarize it for you as best you can. But I can't cover all the points made in this book because it's a thick old boy. If you want to figure it out yourself, if you want to go delving into it, go ahead. It's a great read. Chewy. It's chewy. So let's get into it. The Philosophy of Misery. Chapter 1. The Economic Science. In this chapter, Proudhon puts two opposing forces against each other. The system of its day, which is political economy, and socialism. Now, what political economy is, as I've said in the intro, is essentially old-fashioned capitalism. It's just how things were back then. And socialism is basically socialism. It was how Marx was describing it. It was how a lot of the, I keep bringing up the utopian socialists, but basically socialism was still a thing back then. So, political economy, he basically defines both of them. He defines political economy as essentially legalized robbery. It comes from tradition, a tradition of owning things and making people work them and sucking value out of them. This is originated in farm rent, the use of money, the use of a factory. Basically, feudalism was 100 years ago. Now nobody can eat unless they work for an employer. It's the new baron. It's the new lord. Basically, nobody gets to live unless they work for an employer. And the laws hadn't caught up at this point. So back in the old days, there were liberal governments, classic liberal governments, who believed in not intervening too much. And because of this, the factories were cruel. They were worse than the word today. You can thank our current situation, as bad as it is, with socialist movements, anarchist movements, libertarian things, working class movements. Capitalism was worse back then. That's the funny thing. It was worse. So, police car just went past. Socialism, he defines as they exist to point it out, and they don't come up with a valid alternative. Basically, socialists come up with stuff that copy political economy. They still worship at the altar of force. They still believe in coercing workers out of the product of labour, coercing them to work. They're the same as capitalists, political economy. I'll use the word he uses, because he might not have used capitalism. He uses political economy in this. So I'll use political economy. That's what I mean. So the two teams are political economy and the economists versus socialism and the socialists. One is traditional, religious, and hierarchical. The other is anarchical, utopian. And what was the other one? Idealistic, maybe. I don't know. He puts them basically. They are opposites. But socialism doesn't have a valid alternative. So Proudhon, in his dialectical way of thinking, takes these two guys and grinds them together. And he comes up with something he calls the economic science. It's something observable. It's something discoverable. The way he looks at political economy is, it deals in facts, and socialism deals in rights. So basically what ought to happen versus what is happening. So political economy relies on that. It basically says, I can do this, so that's how it is. Like, I can take away your food and make you accept subsistence living and make you work in a factory for 12 hours. I can put your kids in here, so that's fact. That's political economy. That's what they're doing, basically. And socialism goes, no, you shouldn't be doing that. We have a right not to do that. We should be doing this. We should be doing that. It's idealistic. And political economy, to hell with that. It works. So, what Proudhon looks at in both of these systems is, he wants to take the good from both of them. He wants to take what works, the essence of both, and make something called the economic science. So, interestingly enough, he's not a fan of socialism, which it surprised me when I first read it, because he describes it as what you would think mutualism would be. But mutualism actually has elements of political economy. It has certain things that just work. It's more human. It's more human than communism, and it's more human than capitalism. But it does acknowledge certain things, like, we'll get into it later, but quickly, political economy rests almost entirely on private property. Now, Proudhon famously destroyed property in What is Property? But he acknowledges the idea that if you're there, it's yours. If you have it, it's yours. You own your body, and you own the things you make from the free world. Is in favour of property, unlike the communists and the socialists who go, everything's up for everybody else. The party will decide, and everybody gets to share everything else. You don't have a house. You don't have a product of labour. That belongs to everybody. Proudhon saw this as theft. Communists, socialists, and political economists both steal from the worker. Proudhon believed that property was a good thing if it's yours, and not a good... I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. It's hard not to, because once you've read the book, it's hard not to put it all out in the same way. So I'll stick to the economic science for now. So he puts political economy and socialism at each other. Political economy, immoral, based on what can I get away with. It's essentially just that. What works? What can I get away with? And socialism is what ought to happen, what should be happening. Proudhon sees them as both as forceful, coercive. So, with the stage set, let's see what he comes up with for his economic science. The increase of misery in the present state of society is parallel and equal to the increase of wealth, which completely annuls the merits of political economy. Thus, political economy is justified neither by its maxims nor by its works. And, as for socialism, its whole value consists in having established this fact. We are forced, then, to resume the examination of political economy, since it alone contains, at least in part, the materials of social science, and to ascertain whether its theories do not conceal some error, the correction of which would reconcile fact and right, reveal the organic law of humanity, and give the positive conception of order. Chapter 2. Value. Well, this is the biggest chapter in the book, the most important one. It contains the nugget of his argument, the biggest mortal wounds against political economy and communism, and it puts forward a baby mutualism. Reread this chapter over and over again. If you're only going to glance at this book, make it Chapter 2, Value. It's the most important chapter in the book, and it's dense. Oh boy, is it dense. The mutualism theory is blink and you'll miss it. At one of them, it's like brackets with 2 words. And it was like, oh shit, there it is. So yeah, read this one over and over. So this is going to have a lot of edits in because it's a big old chapter. So how does he start? First, he defines value. So value is split into 2 categories: use value and exchange value. So use value is, I've kind of started back to front. All right, I'll come back to it. Use value is how useful something is to you and somebody else. Exchange value is what can you get in the exchange. So how I meant to start was, if you were surrounded by everything useful by yourself, you're in the Garden of Eden, everything, it's useful to you. You can't really say it has a value, because value is a social thing. Somebody else needs to exist before something can have value. So if I'm surrounded by everything I need, I eat it, I consume, I live, it's fine. How valuable is it? I can't really say. Until somebody else comes along, someone from another island, and says, hey, can I have some of that tree of life? And you go, yeah, what are you going to pay for it? That's when exchange happens. And value and use comes then, because it has to be useful to somebody to exchange it. Exchange value, the point he makes, it's 2 things, and they're in contradiction to each other. They're forever bound, but they're in contradiction. So, exchange value, it has to be useful. You can't have something that exchanges that's useless. And for something to exchange at all, for use to have a value, exchange has to happen. And the contradiction comes from the exchange value very rarely matches the use value. So here's the analogy he gives. Good old 200 years ago analogies. They're always talking about old-fashioned stuff. So his analogy is bags of wheat. So imagine a family has 20 bags of wheat. They consider themselves 20 bags of wheat rich. They can eat those bags of wheat for however long 20 bags of wheat lasts. But they're happy with 10. They're good with 10. And they go, you know what? I'm going to try and exchange 10 bags of wheat for something. I fancy some coal. I fancy some meat. I fancy a little bit of handicraft. Whatever. I'll exchange it for something. Some linen. Those old-fashioned things. So he takes it to the market. And in this market, there's two markets. One of them has a ton of wheat. Everybody's got wheat. There's wheat pouring down the goddamn walls. And he's there with these 10 bags like, guys, what can I get for this? Everybody who would buy wheat, they've got an overabundance of it. They don't need to buy it off you. And you need to now compete with everybody else selling wheat. So chances are, you're going to have to lower your price to get anything for it. Because it's essentially, it's not useless, but the use is way down. The use of the wheat has exceeded its use value because there's so much of it. You can only eat so much wheat. So you'll get a very low exchange value. Even though it's 10 bags still. Now you take those same 10 bags to a market that has no wheat whatsoever. You're the only guy selling wheat. And all of these guys have got like coal and metal and whatever. I can't think of the third one because it's 200 years ago. So you take your 10 bags of wheat and now all of the other guys are competing. You're not competing. The other guys are competing. They all want your 10 bags of wheat. Now your exchange value is high. So use value and exchange value are in contradiction to each other. They're needed still, but they're in contradiction. They're not really the same thing. So from this, political economy takes this contradiction in values and stretches it to unnatural levels. It takes use value. In this capitalist way of production, it has factories that are producing, bam, 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 but just always producing stuff, and cows are on machines, just killing shit. It's overly abundant with use value. It should make everything cheaper. It should make everything damn near free. We're surrounded, abundant with use value. The new capitalist way of producing things surrounds us with use value. It should be cheap. But it isn't because of political economy, the way it works. And it takes exchange value to a whole other level. Basically, it makes an art form out of exchange value. It's still connected to use value because everything needs to be useful to the person buying it, but it exaggerates it. It turns trash into luxury. Consider what a diamond is. It's a rock in the ground. It's a rock. It is a rock. Somebody goes to the ground and pulls a rock out of it, and they shine it up real nice, like the rock. They shine it up real nice, and they go, "Hey mate, do you want this?" "Yeah. How long did you take polishing it up? Was it like 2 or 3 hours polishing it up?" "Yeah, probably. But I'm going to sell it to you for 3 months of your hard labour." Sold, mate. The exchange value in political economy is through the roof. And why is that? It's because the system itself exists to push exchange value more than anything. We're surrounded by buildings, empty buildings, and tons of food. Political economy hoards it, keeps it to itself through laws and police and a whole load of other things, tariffs and legislation and all that stuff. It says, you're not allowed to use that. No. The capitalist is allowed to use it. The landlord is allowed to use it. And they're going to say, nope, nobody's allowed in. Nobody's allowed to work that factory. Currently closed. Not allowed to have this, not allowed to have that. Why are they doing that? Makes no sense. We're living in a utopia. We've got everything we need. Why are they holding it off from everybody? It's because it pushes exchange value through the roof. All the way up. And then they can charge monopolistic prices on the rent of money. Bet you didn't think our money was rented, did you? But it is. We pay for the use of our money because our bank isn't our bank. It's another nation's bank. And we borrow it. We borrow from it. Like you would pay for burgers from McDonald's. And they can charge monopolistic rents on that. Proudhon points that out in another book. We'll get to that. But sticking to political economy, the rent of land is monopolistic prices. Diamonds is another one of those things, monopolistic prices. Luxury is monopolistic prices. Let's get a great quote from Proudhon on this one. To tax fancy and elegance is no less odious or absurd than to tax circulation, but such a tax is collected by a few fashionable merchants, whom general infatuation protects, and whose whole merit generally consists in warping tastes and generating fickleness. The whole system of political economy is based on getting as much exchange value as possible out of things. And it comes down it boils it down to trading trash for your life, blood and sweat. You're trading, again, months of your life for useless things. Luxury is something everybody really enjoys, and it doesn't cost as much. It shouldn't cost as much as it does. But they're taking advantage of the monopoly they have over luxury, over the brand names, over the items that they have control of, and they send it through the roof. The reality is, we should be surrounded by luxury, and it should be way cheaper. But political economy pushes it to unbelievable levels, where people are trading years and years, well, not years, but, yes. If you actually add it up through the entire life you've had, you'll trade years of your life for months or maybe even weeks for somebody else. Imagine rent. We pay more than a mortgage to live in a house we never actually own. Monopoly, political economy. If you can get away with it, that's how it's done. It's permission to rob people. Proudhon points that out. Political economy is essentially, if I can get away with it, if I can trick you, I can. And I know what you're thinking. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with embellishing your product a little bit? And just, if they're making the choice to buy it, what's wrong with that? Well, it's still robbery. I know we've normalized basically being robbed in our society, but it's wrong. When you really look at this, when you really look at how our society works, the producers get paid the least, and the idlers get paid the most. And when you look at the chain of production, everything's cheaper than it should be, really. This bottle, I paid the most for it. I paid the most of it. Who gets paid the least? The guy above me paid less than that. The guy above him paid less than that. That's the system. It's permitted robbery. Everybody gets a better deal from the guy in the end. We've normalized this. And it shouldn't be the case. When you really think about it, I should trade something of equal value to you. But we've been brought up in this system that is that. We've been conditioned to go, yeah, whatever, and just throw our money away on a pint of beer that's $5.40 now, or whatever, just name it, you know what I mean? A bottle of shampoo that has Kim Kardashian on the front, or an Elastoplast that has the Star Wars brand logo on it. And it's 10 times more expensive. It's the same thing. It's the same cheap thing when you go and buy expensive running shoes now. And it feels like pleather. It feels like cheap plastic shit. It's because it is. It's just got the brand on it. And now people are paying 10 times more. And think about it. That is robbery. You're going out and you're producing all the wealth. You're producing what really is valuable. It comes from you. It comes from making stuff. And you're getting paid the least and paying the most. It's actually a system of robbery. So how do we beat this? How do we embarrass this? Who would have thought? Karl Marx figured it out. No, he didn't. It was Proudhon who figured it out. He realized that if you could figure out a constitutional value, you could expose political economy and end it in one strike. So, political economy believes in supply and demand as being the whole of the law. If they can do it, it's fact. It's how it works. If I can charge you this for that, that's how it is. If I can sell you fresh air for £1 million, hey, that's what it is. That's political economy. There is no measure of value, no standard of value. Economic science tells us this, just as the mathematical science tells us that there is no perpetual motion or quadrature of the circle, and that these will never be found. Now, If there is no standard of value, if the measure of value is not even a metaphysical illusion, what then is the law which governs exchanges? As we have said before, it is, in a general way, supply and demand. That is the last word of science. The economists would have you believe that all wealth comes from privilege, from the owning of capital, from the owning of farms and factories and money, titles. They think capital is productive. But when you really think about it, is capital productive? Take a field or a factory and ask yourself, how productive would it be if no workers turned up to it that day? Is it zero? Is it absolutely zero? Maybe the capitalist himself would turn up and, look around all angry and stamp his feet. But no money would be made because wealth comes from labour. Labour is the source of all value in the world. It's this that Proudhon noticed, and he made labour time the constitutional value. So then, constitutional value. Basically, Proudhon figured this out. He argued that because exchange value and use value oscillated, you could figure out a middle point, a constitutional value. It's actually definable. And he argued that it was actually absurd to think the other way, that if there was no constitutional value, things like profit and cost couldn't be figured out either. So they were in denial, the economists. They were almost dusting the tracks. They knew exactly what they were doing when they were sending exchange value through the roof. That was their philosophy. But Proudhon figured it out. He basically put utility and labour as constitutional value. A product has to be useful, and it also exchanges for somebody else's time of labour. A day's worth of labour is worth somebody else's day's worth of labour. Products by products. The natural wage of labour is its product. There's none of this relative value bullshit that all these other economists want to talk about. When you put a middleman in between the producer and the product, when you say this relative value is worth only so much to you, but worth way more in the product. That's where the steal comes in the relative value between the producer and the product. Take that away. Take the con man away, and you have producer and product. There's your price. There's your price of labour. That's what a labourer should be paid. There's your constitution of value. When it comes to exchange, you go to somebody else's one of these, and you go, "Oh, mate, can I have that?" "Well, I don't know. What are you going to give it to us?" And then you have a debate. You have an exchange. A key part of mutualism is the free market, the free exchange. And what he accuses communism of is they rob products from people and they force products on people. That's robbery. Proudhon believes that you should be able to have a say in what you get for your product. And in the oscillation between the price, you'll figure out, it'll basically average itself out over time. There is no absolute one price because people's opinions change, people's circumstances change. But you can have a good goddamn average, which he calls the constitution of value. Hours and utility, trading for somebody else's hours and utility. It's what it always comes down to, eventually, in the oscillations, is how much time you've spent on something and how useful it is. Now, given a system, an anarchist system, that doesn't have to pay rent or tax or interest on money, or its capitalist parasitic pig sucking up all the use value out of its employers, a workers' association, a cooperative without the state. Imagine one of those. They're called usufructs in his terminology. When the worker owns the means of production and they decide what happens, they're called usufructs. So, one of these would produce a product. And they would have this product and they would decide exactly how much it would sell for, exactly what happens to it. If they exchange it with another producer, if they just keep it and eat it for themselves and be self-sufficient. What Proudhon brought up was the idea of a bank of exchange. He didn't call it that in this. He called it, like a collective wealth term. It was something like a mass, I should have quoted it. I'm not very good at these organized videos. I like to just rant about stuff. It's a collection of wealth. fuck it, it's the Bank of Exchange. So basically he argued for the Bank of Exchange, where basically people would offer their products and the Bank of Exchange would go, I need that, or I don't need that, and I will give you money for it. And the producer would go, I want this or I want that. Free exchange. And the bank would go, yes or no. And there would be a lot of these banks. They would either be local, regional, national, international, and the producers themselves would have the choice of giving to whichever of these banks. None of them would be monopolized because it's an anarchist economy. There would be no one forcing you to spend you in one exchange bank or the other. There would be no exchange bank forcing you to pay interest or have a set value of things. There would just be exchange banks. So you would send your product to one or the other, and you would pick the best one who would give you the best deal. He figured out it would be around about 1%. It would be if you give your product to a bank, the bank being a business would have to take something for itself to pay the bills, to pay its own staff, and it would be about 0.75% or 1%, which is fair because let's be honest, it's a business as well. So you give this collective wealth your product and it says, we need that, mate. Here's some tokens to spend in our collective wealth. You go, all right, I'll take that. What can I get in this collective wealth? Anything anybody produces. And you would all exchange with each other. And you would have a specialization here, a specialization there. I want coal, I want wheat, I want a massage, I want a sewage system, I want electricity, whatever like that. You're all trading with each other. And here's where it benefits the worker most. There's no parasite to take away from it. There's no one profiteering from your product anymore. You're getting product for product, labor for labor. You're getting an hour's worth of what you made for an hour's worth of what somebody else has made. Now you tell me, are you richer or poorer in a system like that? Now who would have a problem with that? That's right, the parasite class. Those people who are currently running the system, who live like gods at the expense of everybody else. Those who take rather than make. Those who reap where they don't sow. They would despise a system like this, both capitalists and communists alike. Capitalists because they couldn't feed their ever-feeding war machine that invades other countries and just takes and takes. Communists because they couldn't feed their bureaucratic ultimate system that takes from the people itself. Both statist systems would starve to death in a mutualist economy. There would be no take. There'd be no room for parasites. Doesn't it sound great? And that got us thinking. Because when I started looking into economy and political economy, I noticed a lot of highfalutin, bamboozling words and a lot of confusing terms. And you'd watch it on YouTube and you'd hear how they would work and, fractional reserve and quantitative easing and all the stuff that you hear in economics books. All sounds very confusing. And you see these guys have got amazing jobs and they're all over the place and great lives, It's very believable. And you hear the central bankers themselves talk about things and they just explain what they're doing. They don't really justify it, they just explain what they're doing. And you go, aha, it's all a scam. That's what I realised when I was looking into economics. I discovered 200 ways to say theft. Economics is actually really simple. The trick, the whole philosophy behind it, is to mask it, to cover it all up. You're not allowed to actually see the man behind the curtain. That's the reality of economics. It knows exactly what it's doing. It knows it's a thief. It knows it's a con man. It knows it's scamming everybody every single day. It knows. It's aware of it. It's conscious of it. And it knows it needs to hide itself in these weird terms and these confusing languages that just spin people around and send them in the other direction. But I've been reading enough to realise that economy is actually very, very simple. And here's my example of it. Imagine me and you are going through the woods. English woods. And there's blackberries there. Do you remember those days when you'd go blackberry picking back in the day? You'd take an old quick save bag and you'd go picking the blackberries off, free food, because that's how food is. That's how food is, to be honest. So you go and pick all the blackberries up and you put them in your bag. having a good old walk around, nice day out, and you meet at the end of the day, and you go, how many did you get? And you pull out 2 handfuls, and I pull out only 1 handful. I didn't get very many. Now imagine if I said to you, hey, if I trade you my 1, which is amazing, I should have your 2. You would say no immediately, right? I hope you would. Immediately you would see the scam. You would go, I'm not going to give you my 2 handfuls of blackberries for your 1. That's ridiculous. I'm never going to do that. Yeah, all right, sure. Well, it was a nice try. And then a third guy comes along, and he's got a big robe. It's flowing in the wind. So like a big cape and everything. He's got a tall hat with a gold trim on the top. And he comes along and he goes, my brothers, I am from Jupiter, and my son is Odin, and you must give me all of your blackberries right now, otherwise something bad will happen. I'd like to think both of us would go, no, you crazy man, I'm not going to give you blackberries. And then the guy, he pulls out a gun, and he goes, give us your blackberries or I'll kill you. Shit, oh God. So we'll give him our blackberries, because we don't want to die. So yeah, the third guy goes, he puts his gun right back in his robe, and then he hands both of us 4 blackberries each. One guy goes, oh, yeah, 4 blackberries, yay! We'll call those guys wage slaves who call themselves capitalists. The other guy goes, I just got robbed. We'll call those guys mutualists. Economy is very simple. So to answer the question on what is the cause of all the misery, Proudhon's answer is, it's political economy itself. It's the system we live in. You can kind of see why the Academy of Moral Sciences didn't really want to admit that. I mean, they might lose the funding after something like that, if they published it, which is the tightrope all the economists were walking on as well. But Proudhon, being a working man, a printer, coming from a working class family, had nothing to lose and everything to gain by pointing out this elephant in the room. So, let's wrap this chapter up. And I've missed out a lot, I need to tell you that, because it's a big chapter. But there's almost too much to talk about. So I'll just wrap it up with this amazing quote. Wherever labour has not been socialised, that is, wherever value has not been synthetically determined, there is irregularity and dishonesty in exchange, a war of stratagems and ambushes, an impediment to production, circulation and consumption, unproductive labour, insecurity, spoliation, insolidarity, want, luxury, but at the same time an effort of the genius of society to obtain justice and a constant tendency toward association and order. Political economy is simply the history of this grand struggle. On the one hand, indeed, political economy, insofar as it sanctions and pretends to perpetuate the anomalies of value and the prerogatives of selfishness, is truly the theory of misfortune and the organization of misery. But insofar as it explains the means invented by civilization to abolish poverty, although these means always have been used exclusively in the interest of monopoly, political economy is the preamble of the organization of wealth. Chapter 3. Division of labour. You see, it turns out business owners have this problem. They want to become as rich as possible while getting the most out of the worker they possibly can. And one of the ways they do this is something called division of labour. When you don't have a specialist doing anything, you have somebody who dedicates their entire life to a single task. A lever puller, a button pusher, a box mover. You can see great examples of this in China right now, when you've got people on the factory line who, rather than pay for a robot to do it, they'll pay for a person to do it. And they've got big comfortable chairs, and they're on the phone, and they've got the headphones in. Their entire job is to get a box on the assembly line, rotate it to make sure it's facing forward. That's their job. That's their entire job for 12 hours a day. Oh my God. And another example of it is one of them that's local to me. I saw the job advertised. Is cellophane quality inspector. Basically, you stare at cellophane. Cling film. Big clear cling film that's going past your eyes all day. And you're the quality inspector. You look at the cling film to make sure that there's no imperfections in it. That's your job for 12 hours a day. That's the division of labour. And the problem that the capitalists have is figuring out how to prevent you from losing your fucking mind, but also getting the benefits of division of labour. Because division of labour is extremely profitable. It specialises people. It's super duper efficient. It has one guy who can get paid subsistence living, literally turning a box around or looking at cling film all day. That's so much more cheaper than a machine or a robot to do it. You know, robots need... Oh yeah, some robots are cheaper, some are more expensive. But for certain jobs like that, a person will do. The problem, though, is that when people live lives like that, they go crazy. They're miserable. They hate their life. Because humans aren't box turners. Humans are this weird demigod, this weird thinking, philosophizing, moving, acting, anger, passion, hunting, waiting, patient, art, creative, everything. We are some weird kind of highest life form that we can sense. We're not an owl. We're not a worm. Maybe there's something above us, who knows? But we're not box turners. We're not needle manufacturers. We're not box pushers. We're more than that. And we need to stimulate these things in us to actually feel like we're part of the world. So there's the problem with division of labour. That's why they have to erect suicide nets in China, because people lose their minds. They hate their life. That should tell you something about the world. We're not that. This division of labour is anti-human. So, to start this chapter, the problem capitalists have is to keep division of labour and also be rich. Now, the richest way a capitalist could be is by removing all expenses. But the problem is, they're an expense. The parasite needs to take something. That's the whole point they exist. That's the whole point they own a factory and fill it with people who turn boxes around for 12 hours a day. They need to be rich. That's the system. That's why it exists. So the problem with division of labour is the capitalist needs his suck. So all of these fixes, all of these economic theories, all of these attempts to make it more efficient, make it so much worse. Because the parasite needing his fix has to drive the worker down into a more miserable position. They have to make his wage less. They have to make his rewards at work, his bonuses or whatever, his comforts, toilet breaks, coffee breaks, less. So they can take everything. So, what does Proudhon have to say about this? This is where you see Proudhon's dualistic way of arguing really come into play. It's kind of, you got a little bit of a hint of it in the God section, but this is where it really comes into play. This is where he starts arguing for the positives and the negatives in division of labour. So what does he say? It's massively efficient at division of labour. It creates specialists. You can be a specialist in whatever, and it just works because you can have an entire workplace making boxes, and then another workplace making nails, and then another workplace delivering them. And when these three completely divided labours come together, they have a super fast and efficient system of delivering boxes to people, delivering boxes of nails to people, rather than just having a guy doing it all himself. So that's the aspect he wants to keep. But he wants to get rid of the soul-crushing aspect of it. And the way he figures this out is the synthesis. And we're going to start going a bit faster now because the main chapters are 1 and 2. The synthesis of this is to still have specialised labour. Not as soul-crushing as box turners in China, but you have specialists in a workplace who know their entire workplace. They are basically masters in their workplace. They drive the forklifts, and they do the accountants, and they do the deliveries, and they do... just name a workplace. They're the experts on all levels. They are that. They are that industry. They become the industry, and everybody else becomes their industry. And the product that comes out of that, that person feels a sense of him in it. And he can trade it for somebody else's sense of him. Like a specialist in building, or a specialist in luxury, or whatever. When we become specialists in an industry, it's still divided labour, it's still efficient, but it isn't the soul-crushing labour that is box turn. So, let's finish this chapter nice and quick with a quote. My reply is ready. Interrogate facts, consult humanity. We can choose no better guide. After the oscillation of value, division of labour is the economic fact which influences most perceptively profits and wages. It is the first stake driven by providence into the soil of industry, the starting point of the immense triangulation which finally must determine the right of duty in each and all. Let us then follow our guides, without which we can only wander and lose ourselves. Chapter 4. Machinery. So this one's going to be relatively quick, because it's a simple old message. So, what Proudhon pointed out was with machinery, capitalists, being in a political economy, tend to use machines in the inverse way they should be. Machines should save labour. They should free us to do other things. Free the worker, because machines will do the single task monkey things. They'll do the box turning things. They'll do the needle manufacturing things. But that's not how machines really work. Technically, yes, they replace the labour, but they definitely don't free the labourer. In political economy, machines make workers unemployed. What happens to those unemployed people? Who knows? The capitalist doesn't care. They just make them no longer relevant, make them redundant. Now we've got a machine that does it. What you used to do, what we used to pay you to do, slave, who can't eat anywhere else, now a machine does it instead. But master, how am I supposed to eat? Don't care, mate. Now I'm saving money on your wages. Now you're on the street. That's essentially how machines worked back then, and essentially now as well. Capitalists buy machines not to save humanity, not to free the worker. They do it to save money on wages. That's it. So it's a relatively simple chapter, because Proudhon's fix is give machines to the workers, and then the workers will be freed to do other things, to be more productive in other directions. Once you have machines building things that people used to build, we can build so much more. The machine essentially becomes a human that doesn't need to eat, a human doesn't need to be paid or anything like that, or be anything. A machine's a miracle, and it should be used in favour of the working class. But in political economy, it isn't. Ooh, on machinery, I just had a brainwave. One of the other parallel economies to mutualism is cooperativism. You know the cooperative movement. Everybody knows a good old cooperative. Basically, what cooperatives are is mutualism under the heel of a state. It's the same principle of workers owning their own place of work. I'm not going to get into a deep dive on cooperative. I'll do it another day. But one of the things this guy brings up in the history of cooperativism, this beautiful old book, smells like libraries. He brought up something that stuck in my head in the typical British, subtle, nervous way. He pointed out, back in the Industrial Revolution, how was it the case that all of these amazing factories were, these amazing technologies, these machines, these steamboat things and these electric things, how was it they only ever ended up in the hands of slave masters? Why didn't they end up in the hands of the workers themselves? It's an interesting question. And I realized what he was talking about. The people who are allowed things have to play the game. The people who are allowed to have money for certain purposes have to be slave masters. They're not allowed to give money to people who will free the slave, who will end the system. They're not allowed to have money, to have resources. And that was what this book pointed out over and over again. In legislation, in money, everything. Just in the kind of boycotts, the kind of news stories. Anybody who was trying to free the people, like the cooperative movement did. Democratic workplaces who were running themselves and got eaten away by legislation, bite after bite for 200 or so years. Any kind of initiative that frees the people doesn't do well. It doesn't get funded. It gets sabotaged. And I thought that was fascinating, that people 200 years ago were talking about that kind of stuff. It tells you that this war is still going on. The reason why the Industrial Revolution didn't enrich the working man is because he was not allowed money. He was not allowed to borrow it. He was not allowed to borrow the machines that would free him. Which tells you what? The people who control the purse strings want to continue the slave system. They are slave owners too. Chapter 5. Competition. Essentially, we don't have it. What competition is these days is a lot of government subsidized places that are considered too big to fail. And of course, because they're given free money from the government, they will never fail. So we don't have a free market. And when you've got shareholders owning all of these supposed competitors between drinks and food and places to eat, cars to buy, they're basically all owned by two people. We're essentially today one turn of the key away from a one world government. Stakeholder capitalism. There's no competition. So, that's today. Back in the old days though, when Proudhon was talking, it was essentially a little bit better. So, not perfect competition. But the competition, let's just say it how he was saying it. It's a force that can't be denied. Competition will always be a thing. It's everybody's right to consider their own flesh the sweetest. We are going to compete. It's impossible to stop. The very best a society can do is acknowledge it and let it run free. Competition is actually the best and safest way of guaranteeing a good wage. It's the best way of guaranteeing good workplace situations. Competition is a good idea, and it should be left free. It's a natural balancing force in the world, and should be left as it is. In Proudhon's day, the kind of competition he was talking about was between the capitalists themselves, the business owners. It was who could be the best bully, who could be the best slave owner. That was the competition back then, in the 1850s-ish. It definitely wasn't between the workers. The competition between the workers was, I'm going to live. That was the competition. It wasn't, you know what, I'm going to go and sell my labour to this guy and get a better product. I'm going to go and do this. Lysander Spooner had a great quote. I don't consider myself free because I get to choose my slave master every few years. He's right. That's our option. That's our competition. We have to choose between the nicest slave owner, and they're all in it to enrich themselves. So when Proudhon was talking about competition in his day, it was the capitalists' competition. Now, if you had a nice capitalist who would treat his workers with respect and comfort, and they had a dinner break, and they didn't have too long work hours, they weren't expected to do too much, they wouldn't make as much money as the scumbag who got every last drop of blood out of his workers. He would make all the money in the world. The other guy, he would squeeze all the money out of it. He would replace workers with machines. He would remove all the kind of safety measures, and he would, hey, are you a 3-year-old kid? Yeah, your hand can fit in this chain link. Just get your little kid hands in there. Oh, he's lost his hand. Well, there's no insurance because we're competing with each other as capitalists. And I want to make as much money as possible. Hell world. Absolute hell world. That's the competition Proudhon was talking about back in his day. So, we've kind of already mentioned these fix. The fix should be between the workers themselves. Competition is a force that it's a naturally balancing force. Competition should never be messed with. And this is one of his main issues with communists. Communists, more than capitalists, take away competition. It's one of those ironic things where capitalism, on a level, is better than communism. Because communism goes, no, everything's mine. Centralized state. You have no option. You have not even a goddamn other party who pretends to be a party. You don't even have a different workplace to go to. Everything is owned by the state. So in the fix of killing capitalism, Communism makes the perfect capitalism. It makes one slave owner who you can't leave and who can absolutely abuse you until every last drop of blood is squeezed out of you. Communism is the perfection of capitalism. It's the best slave system you've ever seen. And that's the funny thing about capitalism. That's its shining grace. You can choose between your capitalist overlord. So hopefully you'll have a nice capitalist running you into the ground. But it's in their nature not to. So what's the synthesis? What's the synthesis for this? Obviously, it's to have the workers themselves competing with each other, because that would bring prices down of products. That would raise workplace standards up. That would get rid of parasites. When you have natural competition and consequences, that's a big deal as well. Consequence. When you have people ripping you off and saying like, this meat is 100% meat, or this phone is a free phone, but by the way, there's a 50 quid tariff attached to it. Competition would kill stuff like that, because it would just be able to point it out in a second and go, those guys are robbing you. We're not robbing you. Choose us. And the people who are trying to con you would die. They would starve to death, because that's the beauty of competition. Monopoly. So, I think I've already stumbled across this earlier on in property. So, maybe this is going to be even quicker of a chapter. So, monopoly. What's an example of good monopoly? It would be, I own myself. I own what I make. That is monopoly. That is an unavoidable monopoly. Like competition, it's a force of nature. It can't be destroyed. It's always going to exist. I own me. Nobody else does. That's monopoly. Now, what's a bad version of monopoly? It is fake monopoly. It's created on a document. It's backed up by force for no reason whatsoever. It's legislation. It's the kind of monopoly that makes people super duper rich. Fake monopoly, bad monopoly, is when states will say, you own this product and nobody else gets to make it. Or you own this section of river. Or you own this watering hole in Africa. If you're like if you're like Nestle or whatever like that, and they'll be like, yeah, that water source over there in Uganda is yours. Bad monopoly. And so why is it bad? Why is it bad when I own myself and monopoly is an unavoidable force? Why is it bad when it's just written into law? Because the only way to back it up is with force. If a government says, you own the monopoly on this patch of land, the only way of actually stopping somebody using that patch of land is to beat the shit out of them. Because nobody created the land. Nobody created the rivers. Nobody created, I was going to say mines, but what was the thing before a mine? A coal mine, a lithium mine, a lead mine, or whatever. All of these things exist in Earth anyway. We all are born into this world. We all own everything anyway. We all own it in common. If you really think about it, we do. Nobody has the right to own anything. So where does it come from? Where does the monopolization of land come from? It comes from force. That's all it is. Somebody, at some point in our past, came along with weapons, spears or guns or whatever like that, and went, yeah, all right, I like this, it's mine. And we went, it's not yours, it's everybody's. Actually, I'm going to kill you if you try and use it. Yeah. It's a bad monopoly. And that's where monopoly comes from. Think about any kind of modern monopoly you've heard of, like the money monopoly, land, force, medicine, laws. If you try to do your own version, what would happen to you? You'd get the shit kicked out of you. And is that fair? No. It's just the force of somebody else. And somebody, I don't remember the quote I read, somebody pointed out a great quote, that all of these, the money system especially, we have a money system backed up by force. It's monopolized. Nobody else is allowed to print money the way the Bank of England prints money. We've got a money system that has to be used by force. And it's as bad as it is. My generation has lived through 4 once-in-a-lifetime depressions, recessions. How is it so bad when everybody has to use it? Maybe it's designed like that. But the point is still made. Monopoly is bad for everybody. Well, sorry, not everybody. It's bad for everybody who isn't the monopolist. So what's Proudhon's answer to monopoly? Well, he respects the unbreakable force of personal monopoly, and he's against legislative monopoly. He thinks it's a source of evil. His solution is free individuals contract with each other into workers' associations, and from that, you get the benefits of both. There is nothing in socialism which is not found in political economy, and this perpetual plagiarism is the irrevocable condemnation of them both. Chapter 7. Police and Taxation. In this chapter, Proudhon talks about police and taxation, but he doesn't talk about police in the constable on the street sense. He talks about it in more of a legislative rule sense, more like policing. So he starts off in talking about tax. So he starts off with a fantastic character, and in this is one of my favourite chapters in the book because Proudhon goes full anarchist. There's no doubt about it. This guy is anti-state. And we'll talk about Marx's discussion about this chapter because he misquotes Proudhon like a son of a bitch on tax. So pay attention to this chapter because Marx would have you think Proudhon is pro-tax. Definitely isn't. So here's some of those quotes I can't resist. So in the next quote, Proudhon describes a character who sees the ills of society and fixes it with never-ending interference. Monopoly has stripped the poor hireling of everything: bread, clothing, home, education, liberty, and security. I will lay a tax upon the monopolist. At this price, I will save him his privilege. Landmines, woods, and waters, the original domain of man, are forbidden to the proletaire. I will intervene in their exploitation. I will have my share of the products, and land monopoly shall be respected. Industry has fallen into feudalism, but I am the suzerain. The lords shall pay me tribute, and they shall keep the profit of their capital. Commerce levies usurious profits on the consumer. I will strew its road with toll gates. I will stamp its checks and endorse its invoices, and it shall pass. Capital has overcome labour by intelligence. I will open schools, and the labourer made intelligent himself shall become a capitalist in his turn. Products lack circulation, and social life is cramped. I will build roads, bridges, canals, marts, theatres, and temples, and thus furnish at one stroke wealth and a market. The rich man lives in plenty, while the workman weeps in famine. I will establish taxes on bread, wine, meat, salt, and honey, on articles of necessity and objects of value, and these shall supply alms for my poor. And I will set guards over the waters and the woods, the fields and the mines and the roads. I will send collectors to gather the taxes and teachers to instruct the children. I will have an army to put down refractory subjects, courts to judge them, prisons to punish them, and priests to curse them. And these offices shall be given to the proletariat and paid by the monopolists. Such is my certain and efficacious will. So getting back to the chapter, bad tax and good tax. What could possibly be good tax? We'll save that for the end. We'll focus on the easy question. What's bad tax? So, what Proudhon says about bad tax is, it's nothing but food for the idle. Nothing but. That's all it does. More than that, it makes production more expensive. It makes the world a worse place. Tax is essentially just making things more expensive and feeding an idle criminal class who do absolutely nothing. It kills industry because when you add tax to a product, it makes it more expensive. The more tax you add, the more expensive it is. And it's unnecessary. The further down the line you get, everybody has to add tax to it. So but when it gets to the very end, to guys like me, who make everything as a working person, you've got like 5 more taxes added to it. Do you realise how cheap everything really is? before people have their take, their rent, their tax, their interest on the money that they borrowed into existence. It's all kinds of tax. It's all feeding an idle class of idle parasites. You don't need to talk much of tax to tell you how bad it is. It's obviously a bad thing. So, easy enough to talk about the bad parts of tax. So we'll talk about more of Proudhon's quotes. What I propose to bring to light, and what the economists do not seem to have sufficiently understood, is that the condition in which the labourer is placed by this new phase of social economy is susceptible of no amelioration, that, unless industrial organisation, and therefore political reform, should bring about an equality of fortunes, evil is inherent in police institutions, as in the idea of charity which gave them birth. In short, that the state, whatever form it affects, aristocratic or theocratic, monarchical or republican, until it shall have become the obedient and submissive organ of society, of equals, will be for the people an inevitable hell. I had almost said a deserved damnation. The good part of tax, which is the cherry-picked bit Marx found, was that if people grouped their money together, they could buy things that they didn't have to rely on aristocrats for. Basically, it wouldn't be a tax then. It would be a voluntary payment. It would be a pooling of money. That's what Proudhon said was a positive version of tax. If people just cut a little bit voluntarily off their pay and bought something like a bridge or a hospital or an old people's home or a factory or the means of production or whatever like that, if people voluntarily paid taxes, they could buy things and not have to rely on states and business owners and stuff like that. That was the positive version of tax. But you can't really call that tax. That would be more of a voluntary payment. Another point he brings up is that when governments issue taxes to the entirety of society, when they have smaller taxes for the workers and higher taxes for the rich, it's only ever the poor that really pay that tax. The rich always get away with it because the rich can always just move the cost down to somebody else. If the rich is a business owner or a landlord, they can just raise the rent or raise the price of the product that they're making or fire some workers or whatever. They can just move the cost down. So these so-called taxes for the rich only ever affect the poorest of society. They are only ever bad. That the tax of quotite, separating the producer from the consumer, falls solely upon the latter, thereby taking from the capitalist no more than he would have to pay if fortunes were absolutely equal. Finally, that the army, the courts, the police, the schools, the hospitals, the almshouses, the houses of refuge and correction, public functions, religion itself, all that society creates for the protection, emancipation, and relief of the proletaire, paid for in the first place and sustained by the proletaire, is then turned against the proletaire, or wasted as far as he is concerned, so that the proletariat, which at first laboured only for the class that devours it, that of the capitalists, must labour also for the class that flogs it, that of the non-producers. I'll wrap this chapter up with two quotes, because something that keeps coming up in this, and I've missed out a lot in this book because there's a ton of information, is that capitalists and communists both worship the altar of authority. They're both in favour of force, of coercion. Democrats is the same thing. It doesn't matter if their power comes from a king, a priest, a communist dictator, or the vote. It doesn't matter. It's still the same power coming down on you. You must do this. You have to do it. Coercion. Proudhon's a libertarian. He's an anarchist. So he criticises Democrats the exactly same way he criticises royalists or communists. So, fantastic quote. I'm going to squeeze it in before the end. It is said that the people, naming its legislators, and through them making its will known to power, will always be in a position to arrest its invasions. That thus the people will fill at once the role of prince and that of sovereign. Such, in a word, is the utopia of democrats, the eternal mystification with which they abuse the proletariat. How right's that these days? And let's finish this chapter with the actual end of the chapter. There is a necessity, I repeat, of a major force to invert the actual formulas of society, a necessity that the labour of the people, not their valour, not their votes, should by a scientific, legitimate, immortal, insurmountable combination subject capital to the people and deliver them to power. Chapter 8, the final chapter. Of the responsibility of man and of God, under the law of contradiction, or a solution of the problem of providence. I can't resist but to boil this entire chapter down to 2 words: natural law. There exists a law older than our liberty, promulgated from the beginning of the world, completed by Jesus Christ, preached and certified by apostles, martyrs, confessors, and virgins, graven on the heart of every man, and superior to all metaphysics. It is love. Love thy neighbour as thyself. Jesus Christ tells us, after Moses. That is the whole of it. Love thy neighbour as thyself, and society will be perfect. Love thy neighbour as thyself, and all distinctions of prince and shepherd, of rich and poor, of learned and ignorant, disappear. All clashing of human interests ceases. Love thy neighbour as thyself, and happiness within industry, without care for the future, shall fill thy days. To fulfil this law, and make himself happy, man needs only to follow the inclination of his heart, and listen to the voice of his sympathies. Now, were man to sacrifice his personal welfare for luxurious and advanced enjoyments, perhaps I should accuse him only of imprudence. But, when he injures the welfare of his neighbour, a welfare which he should regard as inviolable, both from charity and on the ground of justice, I say then that that man is wicked, inexcusably wicked. In short, man and the divine, God and humanity, we're essentially the same thing. We really need to start acting responsibly. Something exists in us that's cosmic, something undeniable, something that came with us. A law, a human law, a natural law, a moral law. No man-made law, no legislation can trump that. No fancy hat or flown cape is more important than that. And that, guys, is the philosophy of misery. I've missed a lot out. It's a big book. It's chewy, gotta say. But hopefully I'll give you a good enough summary that you can understand it. Because Pierre Joseph Proudhon is a titan in socialism, libertarian socialism, the father of anarchy, the father of mutualism, the father of an ism that you won't hear about much these days. But it's important that we hear about it right now, because stakeholder capitalism's coming, and that's New World Order stuff. That's absolute tyranny. So we need to start having this conversation, a libertarian conversation, one that doesn't acknowledge the existence of a state. Because let's be honest, either we start living like this as an alternative, or worst case scenario, we scare the pants off them and we force them to make concessions. It's in our favour to start talking like mutualists, to start making this conversation happen. Let's all be mutualists, working class guys. Let's scare the fuck out of them, and maybe even break these chains forever. Bonus content. Alright, so let's have a bit of a rant. It wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't rant about something. Let's talk about this. For a second I thought I found book 2, because I was really wanting to find out what was in volume 2. I was frustrated when I got to the end of The Philosophy of Misery, and I discovered the book that said, end of volume 1. I didn't think. I thought, let's have a look here. Where's it? Whoop. Whoop. Do you not believe it? Where's it gone? There it is. End of volume 1st. What happened to volume 2? What's in it? What's so bad about it? I really want to know. So anyway, in my discoveries, I discovered a book called The Solution to the Social Problem. Now, apparently it was released 3 years after this one, which wouldn't make sense, because it should come out at the same time. Now, Marx quotes volume 2 in the last few pages of this one. So it's definitely a real thing. It's definitely a real book. So why can't we read it? And that angers me. What was in there? I'll tell you the closest thing I found. It was The Solution to the Social Problem. It was that book. And I found that on the Anarchist Archive. It's available in French, supposedly. I bought it off Amazon, and I got some weird 2-chapter thing. Definitely not the thing I found on the Anarchist Archive. But the Anarchist Archive, it explains a lot. It excuses a lot. It says things like it wasn't translated, it was lost to history and all this kind of stuff. But The Solution to the Social Problem, either it's volume 2 or it's a second book that's also been lost to history and fragments. What the hell was so worrying? What the hell was so worrisome about Proudhon? Here's the fragments that are in Solution to the Social Problem. He describes in detail a bank of exchange. He describes in detail the theory of mutuality. It's the first time I've seen Proudhon talk about mutualism and mutuality. He calls it the economic science in this book. But in The Solution to the Social Problem, it's actually mutualism. And there's a third chapter, I think it's on property. But there's also a wrap-up. But in all honesty, to hear about property from Proudhon, just read What is Property. But his wrap-up is where I think it might be volume 2. Because in the wrap-up, the summary, he brings up the chapters headings of the philosophy of misery. And they're probably economic terms anyway to bring up. But he brings them up in the summary of that. I'd like to think Solution to the Social Problem is the philosophy of misery volume 2. I'd like to think it is volume 2, because that would kind of square the circle. Otherwise, there's an entire book missing, and only Marx has quoted a little bit from it. What was he talking about? What was so disastrous? I've just explained the first book to you. That's bad enough, isn't it, from Political Economy? I read The ABCs of Anarchism by Alexander Berkman, and he tears capitalism a new one. There's Emma Goldman's writings. She tears capitalism a new one. It's not criticism of capitalism that they're getting rid of. So what are they getting rid of? Why is it lost to history? I'd very much like to know. I have a theory that it's specifically calling out family names or religious names or specific names. I've got a feeling it names the beast. That's my suspicion. In my personal research, I haven't found the name of the beast yet, but like Philosophy of Misery 1, I'm seeing the gaps. I know where it is, I just don't know what to call it yet, because there's a lot of theories all pointing at each other. Believable theories that use each other as scapegoats. I'm going to wait a little bit before I put my flag on that hill, because it's a big flag to plant. It's the biggest flag to plant. And I still need to do a little bit of research before I do that.